Several months ago, I heard a song on the radio on 101.5 The Mountain here in Roanoke. It was a song by Oliver Wood. This is the refrain to the song.
It's a fine line between love and lust, between truth and trust, yeah, dreams and dust. Yeah, it's a fine line between a hope and a prayer, someplace and nowhere. Yeah, well, it's a fine line. Fine line, yeah, and we're walking it all the time.
It was the comment that there's a fine line between dreams and dust that grabbed me. I thought immediately about the line we say on Ash Wednesday, remember you are dust, and to dust you shall return. And there is indeed a fine line between the dreams, the hopes, the aspirations that we have for our lives, and the dust that is the reality of our limited human nature, our limited length of days, our limited abilities. And the more I heard the song, the more I was captivated by the other pairings as well. Love and lust, truth and trust, hope and a prayer, someplace and nowhere. You realize as you pay attention to those, it really is a very fine line between the definition of each of those terms. Sometimes we can feel then like we are a tightrope walker trying to navigate precarious and difficult decisions throughout life's journey day by day. So Lent, not the stuff that you pull out of your dryer, Lent as a season in the church year is a time when we look more closely at the fine line that we are walking, what it is that shapes us as followers of Jesus Christ and how we live one with another, how we're both a mixture of dreams and dust. Biblically, I think David is the character who most walks this fine line, and so his life is going to be our companion on the Lenten journey in worship this year. We're going to dive deeply into his life in hopes that we will also hear something of our own life in that story, so that we will discover who we are in God and who we are in our common humanity. So today we meet David in his origin story. We love origin stories. Everybody who ever runs for president has to release a biography that tells you their origin story. President Obama did this by talking about the lack of relationship he had with his own father and how that led him to grow and develop in certain ways. President Biden talks a lot about his own father in Scranton, Pennsylvania, losing his job, and talks about as a child how he struggled with a stutter. President Reagan has a statue that is being erected in his hometown where he served as a lifeguard for multiple summers and developed his sense of character, saving 77 lives over the course of the summers he spent there as a lifeguard. Marvel makes hundreds of millions of dollars telling origin stories of their superheroes. Playboy Tony Stark becomes the Iron Man. Peter Parker is bit by a radioactive spider and has to figure out his new superpowers alongside the travails of his high school years. There's the Black Panther, Captain America, Captain Marvel herself. I could go on, but I assume not everybody is a Marvel movie fan in the room. But there's a common element to these stories of a person who's obscure, inconsequential, perhaps even lacking in some way. And yet they're called out of that obscurity and into some kind of heroic act. But lest we think that origin stories only apply to those who become heroes, origin stories can also foretell despotic or tyrannical power. You may not know, but in the origin story of Joseph Stalin, he went to seminary. Did you know that? He gave up his belief in God while he was in seminary and decided he didn't want to serve the church, but he could use that education as an activist. And so he mounted his campaign to take over Russia with some of the things that he'd learned there. Now, Adolf Hitler Hitler basically fabricated his own origin story in Mein Kampf, talking about being raised in poverty and how he had heroic service to the German army in World War I. History's examined that origin story, basically disproving it. Hitler was from a middle-class family. His mother financially supported him as a struggling artist when he was a young adult. He did serve in World War I for Germany, but he was a message runner. He wasn't actually a frontline warrior in the conflict. But he understood something about human beings and how we like an origin story, so he shaped and molded and recrafted it so that he could rise to the power that he took on. We all have origin stories. You might start yours by saying, well, when I was little, my daddy traveled a lot, so we didn't see him. Or the happiest day of my life was when my little sister was born. Or maybe as an only child, I was always comfortable hanging around with adults. Some folks have in their origin story a tragedy, a death, or an illness that shaped who they became and how they understand their purpose in the world. Or sometimes we see early premonitions of who we would grow up to become, even in the origin story of childhood. And so the longtime teacher tells you, I can remember setting up all my toys in my bedroom and playing school for hours, even as a child. We're inspired by these stories to become something into the future. Recently, we've been really interested in the origin story of President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine. He was born into a Russian-speaking Jewish family. His ancestors were killed in the Holocaust. He wasn't someone who grew up with political aspirations. He has a degree in economics, but he actually came to prominence as an actor, developing a sitcom show on Ukrainian television called Servant of the People, where he played a character who was an everyman who ended up running and becoming president of Ukraine to overthrow corrupt politicians. This show happens and basically becomes the truth of his life that he now embodies. And so we're surprised by his lack of political experience. We're inspired by his courage and his honesty. And we're intrigued about this narrative rise that seems to have been carried out by a force beyond him for a particular moment that he must serve as a leader of his people. And that's the thing about origin stories. A common element in all origin stories that we seem to like to tell is that there's something outside of my choice that has somehow directed me towards this particular moment in my life. We do that even if we have to massage or invent the story. We want a story that's connected to some power that predetermined or chose us for this career or this path in life, or that we can blame for the shortcomings and the failures that we've endured. David's origin story is explicit. He is chosen by God to be the king of Israel. And there's nothing that we know of David before this moment. There's no story of him being a precocious young boy who was always bossing his older brothers around. There's no story about how he won a public speaking competition in elementary school that foreshadowed his meteoric rise to power. Bethlehem is not some province that's known to produce strong and capable political leaders. Shepherding is a lowly and unimportant field of work. That's why you leave the youngest son out there with the sheep when the prophet of God comes to town. You heard it when Samuel asked Jesse, do you have any more sons? Jesse has to think for a second because he can't even remember that he has this 8th son out there. I used to think that was pretty neglectful on Jesse's part, but the more kids you have in real life, you realize maybe he deserves a little grace. But the line, of course, that stands out in this whole story is that declaration that God says to Samuel, the Lord does not see as mortals see, for mortals look on the outside appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. See, David stands there before Samuel on that fine line between dreams and dust. You hear it in the story itself. He is the dream of Israel. He's described when he arrives as ruddy and handsome with beautiful eyes. He's innocent, just a shepherd boy trying to do his job for his family in the field, doesn't have political ambitions. He's one after God's own heart. But he's also dust, the eighth son of a lowly occupation, doing the dirty work. He's too small, too young, too inexperienced to carry any kind of importance. And yet there he is. It's God's choice. So how do we tell our own origin stories? Are they just stories of dust? A triptych of locations where we lived and family members and school and work experiences? Is it just chance and DNA combinations and electrical synapses in the brain that make us who we are? Have we determined our own lives by our choices or our failed efforts, our talents, and our intellect? Is it just the dust? That's what life is? Or might we learn to tell our origin stories as stories that carry in them the dream of God as well? Perhaps there were moments in your childhood, moments you couldn't even identify at the time, when God's call was already working. I'm not talking about churchy moments, but ordinary moments where you were with your family or in school, or perhaps endured some kind of loss or suffering that made you aware in some capacity of God's power and presence in your life. You just couldn't name it yet. Couldn't name it yet at that time. Maybe certain abilities or gifts were being cultivated in you. I'm not talking about the ones that make you rich or famous or important, but those gifts that help you walk the path of faith with Jesus: kindness, generosity, honesty, and attentiveness to other people and their needs. Who taught you that? Where was that cultivated and shaped? Because that's the dream of God that is speaking in and through our lives. When Samuel poured that oil over David's head that day, David had no idea what life held in store for him. He just knew that he had felt the Spirit of God come over him. I wonder, over all the years that transpired, how many times David tried to go back and relive that origin story experience with the oil cascading down his face and onto his tunic, feeling once again the Spirit of God in the dusty present that he was inhabiting. I wonder how often in the dust of the day he needed that memory to keep him connected to the dream of God. That's the importance of origin stories. They have power. They remind us that we are not the sole agents of our own lives, but that there is a power beyond us that is inspiring, shaping, molding, influencing us toward who God would have us to be. So let's learn to tell our own origin stories as that mixture, that fine line between dreams and dust. To craft the tale so that we can recall the power of God that brought us through and claimed us as God's own. That same God, who, whether we feel it in the present or not, sustains us even now. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.